In the spring of 1940, as the rumble of German panzers surged through the Ardennes, French soldiers who had once marched confidently in their own armor found themselves confronting the abyss of defeat. The nation that had pioneered tank warfare during the Great War now realized that its machines were sluggish, disjointed, and completely unprepared for the Blitzkrieg that struck them. The memories of that collapse weighed heavily on every survivor, like an invisible burden. By 1944, as whispers of liberation circulated through occupied towns and villages, the scars of those earlier days had yet to heal. French officers bitterly recalled how their once celebrated Char B-1 heavy tanks, renowned for their armor and firepower, had been squandered due to poor coordination, left isolated without fuel, or dismantled by Luftwaffe dive bombers. What had once appeared as steel fortresses transformed into slow-moving coffins, serving as monuments to a doctrine that had failed them. For the French infantrymen of 1944, the term tank evoked a mix of awe and dread. They remembered the chaos of 1940, the thunder of German panzers outpacing their unit, the clattering of tracks on cobbled streets as villages fell one after another, and the sight of comrades fleeing before the onslaught. Soldiers who survived captivity or blended into the resistance bore the scar of knowing that France's armored forces had been humiliated. To them, armor represented something cumbersome, a liability rather than a tool of liberation. They whispered among themselves that nothing could rival the speed of the German machines that had shattered their country in just 6 weeks. Life under occupation solidified those impressions. For 4 long years, France endured humiliation and hunger, with its soldiers either languishing in prisoner-of-war camps or hiding in the shadows as partisans. When they gathered in secret cellars or barns, resistance fighters often speculated about the anticipated Allied invasion. Some envisioned British tanks like the Matilda or Churchill, lumbering steel beasts designed to break through defenses. Others remembered vague whispers of American armor, although few had actually witnessed one. For the majority of French fighters, tanks were still mere abstract aspirations, emblematic of a formidable ally they longed for, yet lacking a definitive image of their appearance. The reality, however, was that the Americans were gearing up to unveil something that would surpass all expectations. The United States Army, having learned from the experiences of 1940, designed not for static defense, but for mobility, coordination, and speed. The Sherman tank, while not the heaviest, embodied a completely different approach to warfare, emphasizing reliability, mobility, and sheer numbers. French soldiers in exile training alongside the Free French forces in North Africa and Britain shared stories of these machines. They were informed that the Shermans could traverse hundreds of kilometers without malfunctioning, that repairs could be completed in hours rather than days, and that columns of them advanced like unending rivers of steel, ceaseless and relentless. Yet for those who remembered the cumbersome French tanks of 1940, it seemed too good to be true. When the summer of 1944 arrived and Operation Overlord ushered Allied forces across the Channel, French fighters stationed in Normandy prepared themselves for the sound of liberation. Many anticipated artillery, bombers, and waves of infantry. Few were ready for the initial thunderous arrival of American tank columns moving inland. In their minds, tanks were sluggish machines susceptible to ambush. However, what they were about to witness would fundamentally challenge those beliefs. The defeat of 1940 had instilled in them a profound skepticism. For some, the notion that armor could ever surpass German panzers appeared to be a fantasy. They recalled the dread of hearing tank treads approach in the darkness, the powerlessness of lacking the speed to flee, and the futility of observing French machines fail mid-march. To conceive that their liberators could deliver something faster, stronger, and more resilient felt almost like a cruel jest. As they approached the year 1944, poised to take up arms and welcome the Allies, they would soon realize that the Americans had developed a weapon that was not only swift, but also unyielding, a weapon that would forever alter their understanding of armored warfare. The French soldier of 1944 was a man burdened by memories. He had been toughened by occupation, yet was tormented by recollections of abrupt defeat. He had endured hunger, fear, and degradation, holding on to whispers of Allied strength. When he finally encountered American tanks, he would not merely perceive machines. He would recognize the manifestation of a new strategy, a hope that history might not repeat itself. However, to fully appreciate that moment, one must first grasp the extent of their disbelief, the shadow cast by the calamity of 1940. Without this context, the astonishment of witnessing America's rapid tanks in 1944 could never be completely understood. By 1941, France had been divided in two. The occupied northern region was under the oppressive control of the Germans, while the collaborationist Vichy regime governed the south. For the average French soldier who had managed to evade capture or returned home in disgrace, existence was characterized by silence and anticipation. The once proud regiments that had marched along the Champs-Élysées now existed solely in memory, as German patrols took their place. In cafes and dimly lit barns, men who had once donned uniforms now engaged in hushed discussions about sabotage and resistance. Their armaments were frequently outdated hunting rifles or pistols, discreetly passed from one individual to another. The notion of opposing German armor with such weaponry appeared ludicrous. Tanks had transformed for them from instruments of liberation into emblems of the overwhelming power wielded by the occupier. The scant armor that the resistance did possess was woefully antiquated. A handful of French tanks had been concealed in barns or camouflaged in fields during the surrender, but fuel shortages and the constant threat of detection by German patrols rendered them little more than rusting artifacts. The Charb 1s, once regarded as invincible, have now become trophies showcased by the Germans or repurposed under new insignia. For the French fighters, the sight of a tank did not evoke bravery. Instead, it served as a reminder of their nation's shattered defenses. They were perpetually reminded that in 1940, their mobility and speed had led to their downfall. This harsh reality influenced their thoughts. The enemy possessed swift, decisive weaponry, while the French had none. Nevertheless, the resistance grew increasingly audacious as time progressed. By 1943, acts of sabotage against rail lines and assaults on German convoys became more organized. Yet despite the risks these men took, they could not shake the memory of an adversary whose armored divisions still appeared invulnerable. They longed for assistance from abroad, and every rumor of an Allied landing sparked a wave of hope among their ranks. When American leaflets were dropped from planes promising liberation, French fighters held on to them as if they were sacred scriptures. However, the recollection of previous defeat made them wary. Would the Allies arrive with machinery capable of rivaling the German panzer divisions that had brought shame to France? Or would history repeat itself? Meanwhile, far from the occupied territories of France, in the deserts of North Africa, French soldiers who had aligned with the Free French forces began to witness the might of American power. Following Operation Torch in late 1942, French units were re-equipped with American armaments and trained alongside U.S. forces. For many of these soldiers, it was their first encounter with the Sherman tank. Its wide tracks and rounded turret appeared unremarkable at first glance, almost less intimidating than the colossal German Tigers they had heard about. Yet, as they observed Shermans traversing the desert with a speed and endurance their former machines had never exhibited, a transformation occurred within them. These tanks did not falter after a few kilometers. They did not struggle with dust or overheat under the sun. They simply advanced relentlessly like mechanical beasts designed for movement. The French officers, who had expressed doubts, began to converse quietly among themselves. Perhaps these Americans had indeed mastered the art of fighting the Germans on their own terms. However, for the majority of French fighters back home, these revelations remained undisclosed. They waited in villages, on farms, and in city cellars, strategizing acts of sabotage with the resources available. They lived half-lives, functioning as farmers by day and partisans by night, always aware of the sound of German boots on cobblestones. Tanks were more a part of their nightmares than their aspirations. In muted tones, they confessed to one another that only overwhelming Allied armor could change the course of events. Nevertheless, skepticism ran deep. They had been promised salvation before, and in 1940, that salvation never materialized. The stark contrast between the lived experience of occupation and the unseen preparations across the Channel characterized this period of waiting. French soldiers in hiding measured time not in months or years, but in rumors. The rumor of an Allied fleet, the rumor of American weaponry, the rumor of tanks that could surpass the German panzers. And while they envisioned such machines, they struggled to fully believe in them. They had endured too long under the shadow of defeat to conceive that salvation could arrive with such mechanical swiftness. Only when steel and thunder rolled across their homeland in 1944 would those doubts be dispelled. Yet during these prolonged years of waiting, disbelief was the only armor they possessed. When the Allies finally crossed the Channel in June 1944, the French countryside quaked with anticipation. For years, whispers had circulated like smoke that an invasion was imminent, that American soldiers with unfamiliar accents and boundless supplies would arrive, that this time the Germans would not be able to halt the tide. For men who had experienced the bitter collapse of 1940 and the heavy burden of occupation, these rumors felt almost surreal. Liberation was a term repeated so frequently that it seemed to lose its significance, and yet on the shores of Normandy it suddenly transformed into a reality. French fighters and civilians alike strained to witness the kind of power their allies would deliver on the beaches. The initial French soldiers who encountered American forces were struck by contrasts that appeared almost surreal. The GIS themselves appeared different from the British troops many had encountered in exile. Their uniforms were more functional, their equipment abundant, and their demeanor confident yet not aristocratic. They conversed with a casual informality, carrying cigarettes, chocolate, and chewing gum, luxuries that were unimaginable under occupation. For the weary French, who had learned to survive on scraps, this abundance was nearly as shocking as the sheer number of men flooding the beaches. However, it was the machines, those massive shapes rumbling behind the infantry, that elicited the most astonished stares. For many Frenchmen, the only tanks they recalled were the slow Char 1s or the outdated Renault that had let them down in 1940. Conversely, the Germans had filled their nightmares with visions of panzers advancing faster than any defense could counter. And now, rolling through the hedges and muddy Norman fields, came something unexpected. American Sherman tanks, dozens of them, moving in formation with a confidence that felt foreign. At first glance, some French fighters were not impressed. The Shermans lacked the menacing silhouette of a tiger and appeared smaller than the monstrous machines depicted in German propaganda. Yet, as the columns passed, their speed and rhythm unveiled something extraordinary. These were not solitary giants inching forward to be ambushed. They were part of a living, breathing system. The sound was unlike anything French ears had previously encountered. Engines hummed in synchronized rhythm, their tracks traversing fields without hesitation. The Shermans did not crawl. They flowed. Resistance fighters crouching at the edges of villages or standing cautiously at crossroads found themselves grappling to comprehend what they witnessed. Could tanks truly maneuver in this manner? Could they maintain the same speed as trucks, infantry, and artillery in a unified advance? For individuals accustomed to tanks stalling, malfunctioning, or lagging behind, this sight was revolutionary. For the first time, armored vehicles appeared less as a hindrance and more as a liberating force. In a small town in Normandy, locals remembered how the American convoys seemed never-ending. Trucks laden with fuel and ammunition trailed closely behind the tanks, ensuring they maintained their pace. French soldiers who had joined the resistance and were now integrated into American units quickly recognized that these machines were supported in ways their own had never experienced. Fuel depots, mobile repair shops, spare parts, everything was meticulously organized to ensure the tanks could keep advancing. It was this dependability, this logistical sophistication that impressed them the most. The experiences of 1940 had taught them that a tank, regardless of its power, was ineffective if it remained idle due to lack of fuel or maintenance. Yet, in the summer of 1944, they witnessed machines that appeared immune to such shortcomings. The Americans regarded their tanks not as sacred, irreplaceable assets, but as practical tools. If one malfunctioned, another would take its place. If a Sherman tank was lost, replacements were always available. French fighters observed how casually American crews joked about their vehicles. Referring to them as Ronsons or Tommy Cookers with a dark sense of humor, all while exhibiting confidence in their operational capabilities. To French eyes, accustomed to scarcity and loss, this abundance seemed almost unbelievable. It was as if the Americans possessed an infinite supply of steel and fuel hidden just across the ocean. The psychological impact was immediate. French soldiers who had questioned their nation's future began to feel a cautious sense of pride emerging. They recognized that the tide was shifting not merely due to numbers, but because of speed. These American tanks did not halt, did not falter, did not relinquish their momentum. They advanced as if the very notion of retreat had been forgotten. As they observed Sherman after Sherman passing by, French fighters began to entertain the hope that perhaps the nightmare of 1940 could finally be erased, not through words or promises, but through the unyielding roar of American tracks. For the French soldiers who had suffered through the prolonged years of occupation, the first prolonged sight of Sherman tank columns advancing inland was an experience that approached the surreal. They had grown accustomed to viewing tanks as rare, lumbering machines, symbols of a past defeat rather than a route to victory. Yet in 1944, as American forces advanced through the Bocage region of Normandy, French eyes beheld something entirely different. Steel waves surged forward in an unbroken sequence, their movement confident, almost casual, as if nothing could impede them. The Shermans did not travel alone. They arrived in lengthy columns that extended beyond the horizon, accompanied by trucks, jeeps, half-tracks, and armored cars. This mechanized ecosystem made French soldiers acutely aware of how far their own army had lagged behind by 1940. The sheer volume of the movement was staggering. Men who had previously witnessed isolated French tanks abandoned on roadsides now gazed in disbelief as the Americans delivered armor in quantities that seemed unimaginable. It was not merely one or two tanks per village, but dozens upon dozens, each prepared for battle, each supported by a logistics network that appeared boundless. Initially, some French fighters questioned the machines themselves. The Shermans appeared smaller than the fearsome tigers depicted in German propaganda, their armor less formidable, their guns seemingly modest. However, they soon observed how the Shermans performed in combat. Unlike the cumbersome French B-1, which required coordination that the army had never mastered, these tanks maneuvered with fluidity, navigating narrow Norman lanes, surmounting hills at unexpected speeds, and turning with a dexterity that belied their size. They did not stop to form elaborate lines. They simply advanced, perpetually in motion. For French observers accustomed to anticipating hesitation and failure, it was a revelation. One resistance fighter later recounted how the ground trembled for hours as Shermans rolled through his village. He characterized the noise as both frightening and exhilarating. Frightening because it brought back memories of German tanks sweeping through in 1940. Exhilarating because this time the columns were allies, delivering liberation rather than conquest. The French soldiers marching alongside them could hardly believe the speed. "They move like cavalry," one officer noted, amazed by the rapidity of the American advance. It was as if the age-old traditions of mobility in warfare had been revived in steel, and the French, who had once taken pride in their light cavalry, felt a spark of recognition and pride. The psychological difference from 1940 could not have been more pronounced. At that time, French tanks had been superior on paper in certain aspects. Heavier armor, larger guns, yet they were dispersed, mismanaged, and deprived of support. In 1944, the Americans demonstrated what concentrated armor truly entailed. The Shermans were not intended to engage the German Tigers in direct combat. They were engineered to swarm, to maneuver, to overwhelm through sheer force. French soldiers witnessing this strategy felt as though they were observing an entirely different kind of warfare. It was not about individual machines asserting their dominance, but about entire formations functioning as a cohesive entity. As the tanks traversed liberated towns, French civilians filled the streets, cheering and tossing flowers. However, the soldiers among them scrutinized the machines with a more discerning perspective. They observed how swiftly a Sherman could stop, rotate its turret, and continue its advance. They were impressed by how the crews operated in perfect harmony with the accompanying infantry, radios buzzing with coordination that France's army in 1940 had never achieved. It was not merely the tanks themselves, but the manner in which they were employed, swift, relentless, always advancing, that left the French in awe. For those who aligned with the columns, whether riding atop the tanks or marching alongside them, the sensation was one of disbelief, gradually transforming into exhilaration. Each kilometer gained diminished a fraction of the shame from 1940. Each German roadblock crushed beneath the tracks of the Shermans served as a reminder that the era of helplessness was coming to an end. French soldiers could hardly reconcile the memory of shattered, scattered armor with the reality of this mechanized surge. They murmured among themselves that perhaps the Americans had uncovered the secret that the French had overlooked. That speed, rather than weight, constituted the true essence of armored warfare. By the time the Shermans penetrated further into the French countryside, disbelief had solidified into conviction. French soldiers who had previously harbored doubts now spoke candidly of the tank's capabilities. They had witnessed firsthand that American armor was not merely functional, it was relentless in its pace. For them, it felt as though history had reversed. The same roads that had once supported German columns of conquest now reverberated with the sound of Allied machines of liberation, faster and more powerful than anything France had ever deployed. In that realization, French soldiers discovered not only hope, but also a renewed sense of purpose. The initial impression had been visual, with endless lines of Shermans rolling by, extending beyond what French eyes could comprehend. However, the second, more haunting impression was auditory. The sound of the American armor was unlike anything they had previously experienced. It was neither the erratic roar of French machines from 1940, nor the ominous clatter of German panzers that haunted their nightmares. The Shermans emitted a steady, rhythmic growl, an industrial heartbeat that resonated through the hedgerows of Normandy. French soldiers characterized it as the sound of inevitability, a mechanical thunder that signified not just movement, but an unstoppable advance. In 1940, when French soldiers confronted German armor, the noise of approaching panzers heralded terror. It signified the onset of encirclement, the precursor to downfall. They recalled the piercing wail of Stuka sirens overhead, the suffocating smoke from damaged engines, and the disorder of retreating formations. That trauma was so profoundly embedded that even in 1944, some resistance fighters instinctively recoiled upon first hearing tanks approaching from afar. However, as the American columns advanced, the sound unveiled a different reality. These were not predators pursuing them. These were allies advancing with precision and assurance, bringing liberation on their treads. The velocity of the Shermans became increasingly apparent in combat. French fighters who integrated into American units were amazed at how rapidly the tanks could reposition. In villages where German defenders had established ambushes, the Shermans did not trudge toward peril, as French tanks had previously done. They maneuvered wide, circled swiftly, and attacked from unforeseen angles. Infantry advancing alongside were astonished at how effortlessly the machines navigated through narrow streets, rotating their turrets while their engines continuously rumbled. It was not a battle of stops and starts, but a relentless tide, one that never relinquished its momentum. For French observers, it was bewildering. They had become accustomed to armor being stationary, vulnerable, constrained by logistics and terrain. But the Americans treated their tanks as if they were cavalry, charging ahead, exploiting openings, never remaining long enough to become targets. A French officer assigned to an American armored division later confessed that he could hardly believe how quickly entire columns altered their positions. They engage with movement, he remarked, not with mass. The French doctrine of 1940 had valued heavy armor and methodical engagements. The Americans had rewritten the playbook, demonstrating that mobility was as lethal a weapon as firepower. The sound of the engines also bore psychological significance. In town after town, civilians and resistance fighters recounted how their spirits lifted when they heard the Shermans before they laid eyes on them. The sound rolled over fields and through valleys like a promise. For men who had endured occupation, this noise represented liberation itself, an anthem of steel. French soldiers marching with the columns observed how even German prisoners reacted with discomfort. To the Wehrmacht, conditioned to fear overwhelming assaults and unyielding pressure, The American rumble signified that the battle was already slipping away. However, the speed of the tanks was not merely physical. It was strategic. The French recognized that the Americans grasped logistics in a manner their own army never had. Supply trucks trailed the columns, providing fuel and ammunition with almost eerie precision. Mechanics repaired damaged Shermans in hours instead of days, and fresh vehicles were always on standby to replace losses. French soldiers came to realize with admiration that the Americans had constructed not just rapid tanks, but an entire system designed to maintain their speed indefinitely. This was a revelation that transcended machinery. It was a lesson in how wars were genuinely won. For French veterans of 1940, the contrast could not have been more pronounced. Back then, tanks had stalled due to fuel shortages, been abandoned for lack of spare parts, or remained powerless without air support. Now, in 1944, they observed armor moving as part of a synchronized orchestra, tanks, trucks, artillery, and aircraft all harmonizing in tempo. The outcome was an advance that appeared unstoppable, a momentum that carried the weight of destiny. By late summer, French soldiers were no longer simply amazed. They were inspired. The sound of Shermans in motion became the soundtrack of liberation, replacing the echoes of defeat with the rhythm of victory. For those who had once been skeptical, disbelief gradually transformed into pride. They recognized that they were marching alongside a force unlike any they had previously encountered, one whose strength resided not only in steel, but in the speed of its heart. As they trailed behind the rumbling thunder of American tanks further into their homeland, they realized that the shadow of 1940 was finally starting to dissipate. For numerous French soldiers, the genuine surprise did not solely stem from witnessing American tanks pass by, but from the moment they were invited to board and fight alongside them. Sitting atop a Sherman, feeling the vibrations of its engines resonate through the steel structure was an experience unlike anything they had encountered in 1940. The French armor from that previous conflict had been cumbersome, claustrophobic machines that required tremendous effort for minimal reward. In stark contrast, the Shermans exuded a sense of vigor. They were not fragile fortresses poised to collapse. Rather, they were robust, adaptable war horses that appeared eager to conquer the path ahead. French volunteers who enlisted in American armored units in 1944 often harbored lingering uncertainties. They recalled how swiftly the German panzers had outmaneuvered them and feared that history might repeat itself. However, the Americans possessed a confidence that was not rooted in arrogance, which was a stark contrast to the scarcity and tension the French were accustomed to. The Americans' relaxed demeanor felt surreal. It was as if engaging in warfare with an abundance of tanks and fuel had rendered battle into something routine. The training sessions left them even more astonished. French recruits were instructed on how to operate radios, coordinate movements with infantry, and depend on speed rather than sheer force. For an army that had been immobilized by poor communication in 1940, the notion of real-time coordination was revolutionary. Within days, French soldiers, who had once feared tanks, were learning to operate them with assurance, marveling at how responsive the Shermans felt in comparison to their own cumbersome relics of the past. They discovered that these machines could pivot quickly, accelerate on uneven terrain, and endure long marches without faltering. It was as if they were being reintroduced to the very essence of armored warfare. A French lieutenant later recounted that during his initial mission with an American tank crew, he anticipated the vehicle would struggle while traversing muddy ground. Contrary to his expectations, the Sherman advanced confidently, its tracks firmly gripping the soil with unwavering resolve. He admitted that he had prepared himself for disappointment, haunted by recollections of forsaken French tanks scattered along the roads in 1940. However, when the Sherman ascended the hill and continued onward, he experienced a sense of childlike amazement. It was as if it were alive, he noted, carrying us on its shoulders, invincible and relentless. The Americans urged the French to have faith in the rhythm of their machines. "Keep moving," one U.S. sergeant advised, "and you'll survive. Halt, and you become a target." This principle struck a chord with men who had endured the constraints of static defense. The French came to understand that their allies regarded tanks as cavalry meant to maneuver fluidly across the battlefield. Engaging in such rapid movement was exhilarating. For the first time in years, French soldiers felt they were not remnants of a vanquished army, but rather riders of a new, unstoppable force. Even the minutest details left a lasting impression on them. Spare parts were perpetually accessible. Fuel convoys appeared to be limitless. Ammunition was always plentiful. The Americans had established a comprehensive support system for their armor, and French soldiers were astonished by the level of efficiency. They bitterly contrasted this with their own experiences in 1940, when tanks would run out of fuel or malfunction without any assistance in sight. Now, when a Sherman sustained damage, mechanics would swarm over it like skilled surgeons, restoring it to combat readiness within hours. To the French, this seemed almost magical. However, the astonishment was not solely technical. It was deeply emotional. French soldiers who climbed aboard the Shermans felt as though they were emerging from the shadows of 1940. Each kilometer traveled alongside the Americans symbolized a journey away from defeat and towards redemption. They started to cast off the burden of humiliation, substituting it with a fierce resolve to restore their honor. Riding alongside the Shermans, they no longer perceived themselves as mere spectators of liberation. Instead, they felt like its creators. By the autumn of 1944, French units armed with American tanks began to engage in offensives independently, demonstrating that the lessons had been learned. However, even as they fought, many privately confessed that they still found it hard to believe what they were witnessing. After years of despair, the sight of France advancing behind swift, unstoppable tanks seemed almost too miraculous. Yet the roar of engines beneath them and the force of steel under their command dispelled all doubts. The nightmare of powerlessness was coming to an end, and the French were riding into history atop the giants of America's armored might. By late summer of 1944, disbelief had evolved into something more primal: rage. For French soldiers collaborating with American armored divisions, the speed of the Shermans was no longer merely a curiosity or a wonder. It had become a weapon, a living force that propelled them into battles where momentum was the decisive element. They had witnessed the columns surge across Normandy, observed villages liberated in hours instead of days, and now they were part of operations where American tanks advanced so rapidly that German defenses collapsed before they could reorganize. For French fighters, who had suffered 4 years of humiliation, this was not merely warfare. It was vengeance delivered with steel and fire. One joint operation near Paris left a lasting impression on many French observers. German units had entrenched themselves in defensive positions, confident that narrow streets and barricades would impede any Allied armor. In 1940, such obstacles had indeed resulted in disaster for the French, whose tanks had become mired in confusion and isolation. However, the Shermans approached in a different manner. They did not slow down to form unwieldy lines. They advanced in organized formations, maneuvering around obstacles, breaking through weaker defenses, and encircling defenders with remarkable speed. The French infantry accompanying them were astonished at how rapidly the circumstances changed. Within hours, strongholds that could have held out for days were circumvented and rendered ineffective. The Germans, who had previously appeared invulnerable, now seemed awkward and reactive. For the French, the impact was electrifying. These were not merely victories. They represented acts of redemption. Each German withdrawal, every forsaken position, and every disrupted line seemed to lift a piece of the national disgrace from 1940. The velocity of the Shermans was not just a tactical advantage. It was psychological. It enabled the French to regain a sense of superiority they believed was lost forever. They were no longer the targets of a Blitzkrieg. They were orchestrating one. The intensity of liberation was perhaps most evident when French forces finally entered Paris in August 1944. Although much of the combat was conducted by resistance fighters within the city, the arrival of Free French tanks, outfitted with American armor, carried the symbolic significance of victory. Civilians filled the streets, showering flowers and shedding tears of joy. However, the soldiers atop those tanks experienced something more profound. They felt disbelief at being present in their capital, not as captives or fugitives, but as conquerors. Many remembered the Shermans that had transported them through hedgerows and villages, the rumble of engines that had become the soundtrack of liberation. Without that speed and relentless drive, they understood that Paris might have remained under occupation for a much longer period. On other fronts, the fervor transformed into ruthless efficiency. French crews operating American tanks battled in Lorraine and Alsace, where they faced German armor on more equal footing. They witnessed firsthand the threat posed by Tigers and Panthers, machines capable of destroying a Sherman with a single shot. Yet the lesson had been absorbed. Speed equated to survival. French and American crews maneuvered their Shermans with the precision of wolf packs, encircling and flanking, ensuring that the more formidable German tanks could not dominate the battlefield. What surprised the French was not merely that this strategy was effective, but that it was also sustainable. There was always an abundance of Shermans, a constant supply of fuel, and a steady stream of reinforcements. This was a type of warfare that France had never been able to engage in before, a war characterized by abundance, where speed and numbers overwhelmed formidable yet isolated adversaries. For men who had once been intimidated by German panzers, this transformation was significant. They no longer felt helpless upon hearing engines in the distance. Instead, they experienced a sense of anticipation, aware that the roar of Sherman signified an impending attack rather than a retreat. The disbelief persisted. It was challenging to reconcile the shattered memories of 1940 with the vigorous momentum of 1944. However, this disbelief was now intertwined with a sense of pride. French soldiers began to believe that their army, reborn in American steel, could restore its honor not only in France, but throughout Europe. The fury of 1944 was not merely blind rage. It was focused, disciplined, and honed by years of suffering. Riding alongside Shermans, French soldiers discovered that speed could serve as vengeance, and that mobility itself was a form of justice. Each village liberated, every road reclaimed, and every German unit dispersed served as evidence that France was rising once more. With each new victory, the French soldier who had once harbored doubts could no longer deny the reality. America's swift tanks had not only transformed the battlefield, they had also transformed France itself. As the autumn of 1944 transitioned into winter, the French soldiers who had marched, fought, and ridden alongside the Americans began to realize that they were witnessing not just a campaign, but a revolution in warfare. The initial shock they experienced upon seeing endless columns of Shermans advancing across Normandy had evolved into a profound recognition. These machines, along with the doctrine that drove them, embodied a new philosophy of battle. Armored warfare was no longer a contest of lumbering giants. It was a choreography of movement, logistics, and coordination. The French, who had previously expressed skepticism, now found themselves adherents of this new doctrine. The teachings were omnipresent. In Lorraine, French units engaged in combat with American assistance observed as Sherman circumvented German strongholds rather than futilely assaulting them. The tanks traversed rivers with temporary bridges constructed almost overnight, their momentum unyielding. French officers could scarcely fathom the pace of such operations. Where their 1940 manuals had advocated for deliberate, methodical advances, the Americans showcased the efficacy of fluidity, striking one day in one direction, and the following day 50 kilometers away. For French soldiers, this was nothing less than a revelation. Even in the face of setbacks, such as during the fierce confrontations in the Ardennes in December, the French recognized the distinction. The Germans continued to depend on sudden armored offensives, attempting to replicate the shock of 1940. However, the Americans absorbed the impacts, reorganized, and launched their tanks in counterattacks with remarkable speed. French units that fought alongside them were astonished by the resilience of the system. Whereas the French army of 1940 had disintegrated after the initial blow, the Allies now recovered, demonstrating that mobility and logistics could endure even the most intense German assaults. By early 1945, French soldiers were no longer mere spectators of American tank warfare. They had become active participants. French armored divisions, re-equipped with Shermans, advanced through Alsace and into Germany itself. The disbelief of 1944, the sheer amazement that the tanks could move so swiftly, be so dependable, and arrive in such boundless quantities, had evolved into something more profound: conviction. They had faith in the system because they had witnessed its effectiveness, and they integrated those lessons into their own military doctrine. The French army, post-war, reconstructed its armored forces based on the principles it had assimilated from the Americans: speed, coordination, and the critical nature of supply. The transformation extended beyond mere tactics. For those men who had endured the trials of 1940, engaged in the resistance, and subsequently participated in the armored advances of liberation, the swift American tanks emerged as emblems of redemption. As they rode Shermans into towns that had been liberated, they experienced the humiliation of their previous defeat, being eradicated by the force of momentum. They came to understand that armor could serve not only as the instrument of their oppressors, but also as the means of their liberation. The skepticism that had once plagued them transformed into pride, and this pride played a crucial role in the resurgence of both the French army and the nation. In the aftermath of the war, when French officers compiled their reports and soldiers recounted their experiences, one recurring theme was speed. They expressed their astonishment at how the Americans had imparted the lesson that a tank was not merely a mobile fortress, but a dynamic weapon, an engine of pace. Many confessed that they had never genuinely accepted this notion until they witnessed the rapid advance of Shermans across their homeland, moving faster than fear, faster than doubt, and even faster than memory itself. Therefore, the legacy of 1944 encompassed not only liberation but also transformation. The French soldier, once demoralized by the recollection of Blitzkrieg, had acquired a new approach to warfare from his allies. The swift American tanks had demonstrated to him that victory was achieved not by remaining stationary, but by maintaining relentless movement, by ensuring the continuous roar of engines until the enemy was defeated. What had initially been disbelief in 1944 evolved into a guiding principle for the future. In this journey, from humiliation to wonder to conviction, the French soldier discovered not only a novel method of warfare, but also a renewed sense of dignity.